Uh, in this second session on industrial policy, after having talked about the scope of industrial policy, what basically is industrial policy, we are going to discuss the second industrial policy that the independent India had. And this industrial policy was unveiled in 1956. You would recall that the first industrial policy was unveiled in 1948. And then there were so many improvements which were brought about, and the 1956 industrial policy was basically a more comprehensive industrial policy. We'll have a look at the various provisions of this industrial policy. Number one thing which happened was that industrial policy basically expanded the role of public sector, and this is when we compare it to the industrial policy of 1948, where again, of course, the public sector was given a dominant role, but it was still restricted to only a few sectors. However, in 1956, the role of public sector was expanded further. So, if you look at the various categorization of industries which came up, basically industries were categorized into three different categories. And the first category which was there, the Schedule A, the first category was termed as Schedule A because actually they were mentioned in the schedule. So it was actually mentioned in the annexure of the industrial policy as part of Schedule A. That is why these kind of industries were given this nomenclature, Schedule A. So these Schedule A, they were basically 17 industries, and they were to be exclusively in the public sector, which means no private sector entity could have entered these 17 industries. So the first schedule was basically restricted only and only to the public sector enterprises, only and only for the public sector enterprises. And the industries which were there, you can have a look at the various industries which were there. You can see that arms and ammunitions. Now again, have a look at the industries and you will find that these are very, very strategically very important industries: arms and ammunition, atomic energy. Then as far as basic industries are concerned, you will have a look at the electricity generation and distribution. Heavy industries would mean heavy electrical machinery, heavy electrical machinery, so heavy equipment. So basically these industries were reserved exclusively for the public sector. Then have a look at the iron and steel, coal. They are all basic requirements. Mining of various metals, and then apart from that the mineral oil, the crude oil. So these kind of sectors were kept exclusively for these kind of industries were kept exclusively for the public sector. No private enterprise could have set up its unit in these industries. So this was Schedule A. And then there was Schedule B. Now these were those industries in which there was a presence till 1956, and because of the provisions in 1948, there was a presence of both private as well as public sector enterprises in these kind of industries. So there were both public as well as private sector enterprises who were offering these kind of services, or who were actually producing these kind of goods. But then it was decided that slowly, very, very gradually, these industries would be progressively state-owned, which means slowly the major role in these kind of industries would be played by public sector. And how was this expected to happen? It was decided that no more private sector units would come up in these industries. So any new unit that would come up in these industries would have to be a public sector enterprise. So this way, slowly these 12 industries would slowly be dominated by the presence of public sector, and this was the whole game plan at that point of time. And I have given you the reason that the whole thinking was that the role of the public sector enterprises has to be expanded. So these Schedule B, again, since they were mentioned in the second or the B schedule, so they were they came to be known as Schedule B industries. So they were to be progressively state-owned. So new undertakings will have to be allowed only in the public sector. So though there were some private sector enterprises already present in these industries, they were allowed to continue, but no new private sector entity could have come up, could have entered these industries, entered these sectors, and the existing ones could not have opened up a new unit also after 1956. So these were the industries which we now know as the Schedule B industries, and I've only mentioned 12 of them. I've only mentioned here 8 of them. The point is that you should not cram all these things up. You should just have a basic idea about the approach on the philosophy. Like I said, if you look at the Schedule A, you would find that these were mainly basic industries which are very much important for the development of the infrastructure, be it mining, be it iron, steel, coal, power production, basically electricity generation, and likewise heavy industries, because these are all heavy industries and heavy electrical goods, machines. They are all required for various kind of they're all capital items, and they're required for various type of productive purposes. And none of these industries is a consumption kind of an industry, or an industry which is basically producing consumer goods. Have a look. None of these are consumer goods. You understand? Almost you don't find any of the consumer goods here. So though I've mentioned, again here also I've mentioned 7, instead of 17 I've only mentioned 12, but none of them are basically consumer goods. So there is no mention of, let's say, a consumer durable item. There is no mention of FMCG products. So the products, those fall under the consumer goods item, they are not being included in either Schedule A or Schedule B, because the whole philosophy was whatever is important for the economy is strategically important for the country. For example, defense equipments, arms and ammunition. Here, have a look at aircraft manufacturing, arms and ammunition, even shipbuilding. So, defense point of view, they are also important. Strategically, mineral oil, very, very important, because the whole economy runs on mineral oil. The machines run on mineral oil, transportation. So, they were all strategically important industries, or industries which had something to do with the infrastructure development. And these were kept under the exclusive control of public sector. Here also you would find that they were very, very important for the economy, and that was why they were kept. It was thought that they will be brought under the public sector control slowly and gradually. Right? So these were the Schedule B industries, and then we had the Schedule C industries. Now these were all the other remaining industries which were kept open for the private sector to enter. So the private sector enterprises could have set up their units in these industries which were part of the Schedule C. So you can have a look here, you can understand here that most of the responsibility as far as basic industries were concerned, as far as infrastructure related industries were concerned, strategically important industries were concerned, most of the responsibility was basically delegated to the public sector enterprises. And we know that there was a reason behind that. Number one reason is that generally private sector enterprises, they are more interested in making quick profits. So naturally they are not going to invest in those kind of sectors which have a long gestation period. And I have discussed gestation period earlier also, when we were discussing the public sector, private sector, cooperative sector, and so on and so forth, in probably unit 4. So naturally public sector enterprises will have to fill up this particular gap. And again, the industries which are strategically important for the country, for the economy, they simply cannot be left to the whims of the private sector, and that is why public sector was asked to play a more dominant role in these kind of industries. Fine. Now let us look at some of the other provisions of the industrial policy of 1956. Industrial policy 1956, what were the provisions for the private sector? It was decided, and it was mentioned in the policy that the private sector would be regulated as per the provisions under the Industrial Development and Regulation Act of 1951. We are basically not going into this particular act. This is not part of the syllabus. And however, you can gain some information about this on internet, on Wikipedia also. Then as far as the private sector was concerned, there was a licensing regime which was implemented. And so if a private sector enterprise want to set up a new unit, they want to even expand their capacity, expand their capacity means let's say they can produce 1000 items per day, and they want to somehow increase this capacity to, let's say, 2000, double up this capacity 2000. They would first have to go to the government and seek a license for that. Likewise, within a particular capacity, if they want to increase the production volumes, again they had to seek a license from the government. So capacity expansion is when you can, let's say, produce 1000 goods and you want to expand your factory area so that you can produce 2000 goods. On the other hand, production volume is you can produce 1000 but you are producing only 600 because there is demand, let's say, only for 600, but within the capacity that you have, that is of producing 1000, if you want to increase your volume from 600 to, let's say, 750, then this is an increase in the production value, right? So for all these changes, the private sector was required to obtain license from the government. Now please understand, this was the kind of regulation which existed at that point of time from 1956 till almost 1991. So whenever a company wanted to increase its production capacity, production volume, or to maybe set up a new unit, they had to seek license. And that was why the time before 1991, when we will see that we had the new economic policy, the time before that, the private firms were expected to take license for all sorts of things. And that was what the time before that is many a times known as the permit Raj and the license Raj, right? And you can understand that this was a feature of, this basically is a feature of a command and control economy, and India was more oriented towards a command and control kind of economy at that point of time. And if you compare it with what is the scenario nowadays, you would find that many sectors, the companies don't have to go for a license. First of all, they can start increasing their production volumes without even having to give a notice to the government. So in that sense, we have now moved more towards the capitalist philosophy, and in that sense we have moved from left to right. I hope you remember our discussion when I talked about India being a mixed economy, but India being a different situation in the continuum between the capitalist economies and the communist economies. So now we have moved from left, that is a communistic kind of a regime or command and control regime, to a more liberal regime. So we are moving slowly and gradually from left to right. So I hope you can connect it with our discussion there in probably unit 2, where we talked about the different economic systems. So in that sense, India has now become more of a liberal economy, and we have given more freedom for free play to the private sector, right? So at that point of time, however, we see that there was a licensing regime which was in existence, and then however, the industrial policy 1956 promised that the private sector would be provided a level playing ground. They would not be discriminated against when compared to a public sector enterprise. So the approach of the government would be neutral. There would be no distinction, no discrimination against the private sector enterprises. So that was one thing which was promised to the private sector, that the government would deal with them even-handedly and they would not be discriminated against vis-a-vis a public sector enterprise. So what probably government wanted to tell them was that the private sector enterprises would have, the public sector enterprises will have to play by the same rules of the game which apply on the private sector enterprises. Then the government also said at that point of time, industrial policy 1956 also said that it is the responsibility of the government to provide a conducive environment so that the private sector enterprises can prosper and that they can contribute to the development of the Indian economy, of the country's economy. And it was specifically mentioned that it was the duty of the government to provide various infrastructure facilities like the transportation, regular power supply, which is very must for running a factory or running an industry, and then timely access to finance, credit. So it was mentioned that this is an obligation for the governments of the day. They should be providing these facilities to the private sector enterprises. And then it was also said that the cooperative sector, entities which were established in the cooperative sector, and I think you would remember certainly our discussion on cooperative sector, they would be provided financial assistance also. So this was also mentioned, and you can now understand what was the basic logic behind this. You know that cooperatives actually bring together people who otherwise lack in resources, and they somehow assist these people in gaining, for example, access to market, in buying raw materials at lower prices, or maybe in providing various agricultural inputs, or maybe providing access to credit. So cooperatives play a very important role, specifically as far as the lower income strata of the society is concerned. That was why the policy document said that the cooperative sector would be provided financial assistance. Let's have a look at the other features of the industrial policy 1956. Small scale enterprises were encouraged. I think you know what was the logic behind this. You know that small scale industries, they generate a lot of employment in India. Large scale industries are only located at a few industrial centers in the country, while the small scale enterprises are almost evenly distributed throughout the country, so they can play a big role in ensuring that there is a balanced regional economic development. So there are so many aspects which make small scale enterprises very, very important for an economy, and that was why government said that subsidies would be provided to small scale enterprises. Differential taxation, which would mean that the small scale enterprises would have to pay less taxes, if at all they have to pay any. So they will have to pay less taxes when compared to large scale enterprises, and government would take steps to expose these small scale enterprises to modern technology, so that their products can compete with those of the large scale entities, large scale enterprises. And then one more aspect was brought in. Now these were positive steps. Please have a look. You are just providing some kind of a positive push to the SSIs, but this was a step which basically talked about restricting the production volumes in the large scale industries. Why? So that at least some space is left for the small scale industries to sell their product, to sell to some of the customers, to sell some of their products, so that not all the market is cornered by the large scale enterprises. So it was said that the production volumes would be restricted in large scale industries, so at least some of the market can be catered to by the small scale enterprises. Now this was where government restricted even those large scale enterprises which were actually being run very, very efficiently. So how these were the positive aspects. They were only talking about encouragement, and this was basically restricting the large scale industries. So these were the aspects of the industrial policy which probably cannot be considered to be very, very positive, right? And whenever you have to criticize the industrial policy of 1956, you can actually mention these kind of provisions which were there in the industrial policy 1956. Whereas this is a positive intervention by the government, this particular aspect where you are restricting the large scale enterprises, though they might be operating very, very efficiently, this cannot be said to be a positive intervention, right? However, industrial policy 1956 also talked about industrial development in backward areas. So it was said that if a particular entity wants to set up its unit in a backward area, then the licensing provisions would be easier to comply with. So they would not be as difficult as when some entity is opening up a unit in a developed urban area. So the licensing provisions would be relatively easier to comply with, and then such units which are being opened up in these backward areas, and the backward areas were basically defined by the government. So which areas can be termed as backward, this had to be basically defined by the governments. So if units are setting up their enterprises in backward areas, they were to be given subsidized power, which is basically power at relatively lower prices, because the rest of the charges for the power supply would have to be incurred by the government. So subsidized power was promised to these units. Then the industrial policy, you would remember that we had discussed that industrial policy, labor issues also fall under the purview of industrial policy, and you would see that in 1956 industrial policy there was a provision, there was a significant space dedicated to labor amenities. Also, it was expected of the businesses to incentivize workers, to provide them incentives for good work, for good performance, for achieving targets. And apart from that, it was also expected that the businesses, that the various enterprises which are there, they will work to improve the working conditions for their workers. Working conditions include, for example, is there availability of sufficient restrooms, toilets? Is there the temperature control working fine, humidity control working fine? Do we have a first aid kit at the production floor, at the shop floor? So these were basically the working conditions. Do we have safety equipments for the workers, safety gear? So these were basically working conditions, and it was basically expected of the businesses that they will try to improve working conditions for the workers in their factories and establishments. Another issue which was touched upon by industrial policy 1956 was, and I have discussed this earlier also, that it specifically talked about setting up institutions for developing technical and managerial personnel, because it was understood that India would require quite a large number of industries to develop as an economy, and for that to happen we cannot always rely on technical personnel from abroad, on managerial personnel from abroad. We will have to have our own pool of technical manpower. Technical manpower would mean people who know about inventory management, people who, let's say, would know about maintenance of a machine, people who would know about how to prepare a book of account and how to maintain account. So these were basically technical manpower. And again, managerial power, you know already, marketing manager and a production manager. So we needed to have these kind of people available in our own country, so that we do not have to bring them from outside and also spend a lot of our foreign exchange on bringing these kind of personnel from outside. So it was expected that, it was thought that we need a large pool of these kind of people who are skilled technically or managerially, so that they can work in our domestic industries which are set up inside our countries, which are set up in our country. And so it was said that industrial policy would try to not only set up but to strengthen institutions which can develop these kind of technical and managerial personnel. And there was an impetus on setting up of more IITs, Indian Institutes of Technologies, and then we also started setting up various ITIs, Industrial Training Institutes, and there was also this thinking that some of the management institutes, Indian Institutes of Management, should also come up. So that was basically which was touched upon, which was basically touched upon by industrial policy 1956, and because of which now we have a number of IITs and IIMs working here in India, functioning here in India, and producing expert and skilled manpower for purpose of our own to serve our own industries here in India. With this, I think we have completed our discussion. We have completed our discussion on industrial policy 1956. In the next session that we'll have, we would move on to industrial policy 1991. We would be skipping the industrial policy 1977 and 1980. I hope you remember the reason. 1977 government change, so naturally the new government had a different philosophy, and to put that philosophy in words, they had to have a different industrial policy also. Their philosophy was different, industrial policy was different, and they basically came up with their own industrial policy document 1977, which talked about their philosophy. And since again there was a change of government in 1980, and the government which was there prior to 1977 and which was led by Mrs. Indira Gandhi the government came back to power in 1980, and naturally the 1977 policy document was discarded and a new policy, 1980 policy, was formulated, which was not very different from the 1956 industrial policy. So the real change came in 1991 when we actually went for liberalization, privatization, globalization, and we actually tried to rid our economy of license and permit Raj. And that is why we are not going to talk about 1977 and 1980, and we are going to straight away move to industrial policy 91 in the next session. Till then, go through this particular discussion that we had today, and kindly let me know in case you have got some queries. Thank you very much.